The mule kept walking. That detail matters. The mule that had been carrying the most beautiful man in all of Israel through a forest of battle kept walking, calmly, without its rider. Because its rider was no longer on its back. His head had caught in the branches of a great oak tree. The mule walked out from under him and left him hanging there, between the ground and the sky, unable to reach either. His name was Absalom. He was the third son of King David. He had the most spectacular hair in the kingdom, thick and heavy enough that when he cut it once a year, it weighed 5 pounds. He rode a chariot through Jerusalem, with 50 men running before him. He had spent 4 years carefully, methodically, brilliantly stealing the loyalty of every man in Israel who had a grievance with his father. He had driven the greatest king in Israel's history out of his own capital city, on foot, and now he was hanging from a tree. In a moment, the man his father had specifically ordered his commanders to spare would be killed anyway, by 3 javelins, and then by 10 soldiers finishing the work. His body would be thrown into a pit and covered with stones. Not the burial of a prince, the burial of a criminal. And when the news reached David, the man Absalom had spent a decade trying to destroy, David's response would be one of the most heartbreaking lines in all of Scripture. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died instead of you." A father weeping for the son who tried to kill him. This is the story of how one of the most gifted, beautiful, and strategically brilliant people in the entire Bible destroyed himself. Not because he lacked ability. He had more ability than almost anyone around him. Not because he lacked opportunity. He had every advantage a man could have in his world. He destroyed himself because of what he was carrying inside. And to understand what that was, we need to go back to where it started. Not to Absalom's rebellion. Not to the chariot and the 50 runners. We need to go back to a room where a door was bolted, and a young woman's cries echoed through a palace that should have protected her. Stay with me. Before we can understand what Absalom became, we need to understand what he was. The scripture in 2 Samuel chapter 14 makes a statement that it repeats nowhere else for any other individual in the entire Bible in all Israel. There was no one so highly praised for his physical beauty as Absalom. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. This is an extraordinary thing for an ancient text to say. The Bible is not generally in the business of cataloging physical appearances in this way. When it does note someone's appearance, it is usually relevant to the story. Here, it is deeply relevant. Absalom was, by every account available to us, the most visually striking person in the kingdom. His hair in particular was exceptional. He let it grow throughout the year, and when it became too heavy to wear, he would cut it. When he cut it, the weight came to approximately 5 pounds. Thick, long, magnificent. People talked about it throughout Jerusalem. He was also royally connected on both sides. His father was David, the king of all Israel. His mother was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. That made Absalom a prince twice over. He had David's charisma and warrior blood, and his mother's royal lineage and the political instincts that came with it. He had a full sister named Tamar, born from the same mother. She was described in Scripture with the same language used for Absalom: beautiful. In a royal household full of half-siblings born from different wives, these two were especially close. Same mother, same physical gifts, same status as children of a foreign princess. What happened to Tamar is what set everything else in motion. Not because Absalom was looking for a reason to rebel, not because he had already decided he wanted the throne, but because what happened to his sister, and what did not happen afterward, changed something fundamental in how Absalom understood his father, his world, and himself. Amnon was David's firstborn son. He was the heir to the throne of Israel. He was powerful by inheritance and position, even before he had done anything to earn either. And he had developed an obsession with Tamar, his half-sister, that the text describes with clinical precision. He wanted what he could not have, and the wanting made him physically ill. His friend Jonadab noticed his condition and offered a plan. Pretend to be sick. When the king comes to check on you, Ask for Tamar to come and cook for you in your sight." David, suspecting nothing harmful in a request that seemed simply the wish of a son who wanted his sister's company, sent word to Tamar. She came. She baked bread in front of him, and when everyone else had been dismissed from the room, when they were alone together, Amnon took hold of her. What Tamar said in response is one of the most precise and devastating moments in all of Scripture. She did not scream. She reasoned with him. She appealed to his dignity, to his status, to the possibility of another path. She said, "Do not do this. Such things are not done in Israel. Do not commit this outrage. Speak to the king. He will not withhold me from you." She was trying to give him a way out. She was, in the middle of her own terror, trying to find a path that did not require this. He did not take it. He was stronger than she was. The text does not soften this. It records what happened. And then it records what happened next. Amnon's desire turned immediately to hatred, not guilt, not remorse, hatred. He called his servant, had the door bolted behind her as she was thrown out. Tamar walked out of her half-brother's house in broad daylight, her princess's robe torn, ashes on her head, crying aloud as she went. She walked through the palace compound in public grief, the outward appearance of her inner devastation visible to anyone who looked. Absalom found her. He read the situation before she said a word. He asked, "Has Amnon been with you?" He already knew. The torn robe, the ashes, the weeping. He told her to be quiet for now. He took her into his house. He gave her shelter. And the text records that Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house. Desolate. That word. Desolate. Her future. Gone. Her position as a marriageable princess. Gone. The life that had been available to her before that morning. Gone. And every single day that Absalom looked at his sister living in that condition under his own roof, something was being built inside him. When David heard everything that had happened, he was very angry. The text says this plainly. The Hebrew conveys intense, burning rage. David was furious. And then he did nothing. No punishment was ordered. No justice was served. Amnon, the heir to Israel's throne, faced no consequence. He kept his position. He kept his access to the palace. He kept his future. The scholars have debated why. Some point to David's own history, the adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah, the judgment of Nathan that the sword would not depart from his house. Perhaps David felt he had surrendered his moral authority to judge. Perhaps he was paralyzed by guilt over his own past. Others point to something simpler. Amnon was David's firstborn, his heir. To punish Amnon severely, as the law of God demanded for what he had done, would mean losing his succession. David loved his sons, all of them, often beyond the point where love was wise, and that love made him incapable of the action the situation required. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. Every person in the royal household received a clear message from David's silence. If you were important enough, if David loved you enough, consequences did not apply to you. Tamar's suffering was less important than Amnon's position. Justice in Israel had favorites. For Absalom, this was not merely a personal wound. It was a lesson about how the kingdom actually worked, about what kind of king his father actually was, about the gap between the legend of David and the reality of David that only people close to him could see. The man who had killed Goliath and defeated the Philistines could not discipline his own son. Absalom said nothing to Amnon, not a threat, not a confrontation, not a single word of accusation. He spoke to him neither good nor bad. That silence was more dangerous than any threat he could have made. Absalom waited. 2 full years passed between Tamar's assault and Absalom's response. 730 days, during which Absalom watched Amnon move freely through the palace, eat at his father's table, receive his status as heir without interruption. Most people would have acted within weeks. The grief was immediate and real. Tamar was in his house, visibly broken. The injustice was current, not abstract. Every morning he could see what Amnon had done, and what David had refused to do about it. Absalom waited 2 years. This is the first indication of who Absalom actually was, underneath the beautiful appearance. He was not a man of impulsive anger. He was cold and strategic, and capable of extraordinary patience when the calculation required it. He understood that acting in the heat of grief would give Amnon warning, time to defend himself, time to appeal to David. A response served cold, at exactly the right moment, would be different. He also needed the right setting. Not the palace, where the king was present and royal guards were on hand. Somewhere else, somewhere of his own choosing, where Amnon would come willingly, and where Absalom would control every variable. 2 years gave him the thing he needed most, the passage of time. The longer he waited, the more Amnon would relax. The more everyone would assume that if Absalom intended revenge, it would have come already. 2 years was long enough for the palace to lower its guard completely. When Absalom finally made his move, sheep shearing season had arrived. In ancient Israel, sheep shearing was a time of celebration, feasting, and drinking. It was the harvest of the flock, a season of abundance and rejoicing. Absalom held a feast at Baal Hazor, in the hills near Ephraim, and he invited all the king's sons. The invitation looked like an olive branch. Absalom invited David himself first, which was either genuine hospitality or the most important part of the plan. If he invited the king, the occasion seemed innocent. If David declined, which Absalom almost certainly knew he would, citing the expense to his son of hosting the full royal entourage, then the invitation to the other sons would carry no suspicion. David declined. He gave his blessing and suggested they go without him. Then came the specific request that Absalom had been building toward. "Please let my brother Amnon come with us." David hesitated. Even he sensed something specific about that request. He asked, "Why should he go with you?" Absalom pressed until David relented. Amnon went. All the king's sons went. The feast began in exactly the way a feast was supposed to begin. Wine was poured, food was served, and the princes of Israel relaxed among people they had no reason to distrust. Amnon had no particular wariness. 2 years had passed. He drank freely, as people do when they believe they are safe. Absalom had already given his servants their instructions. "Watch Amnon. When his heart is merry with wine, when I give the signal, strike him and kill him. Do not be afraid. This is my command. Be courageous." He used military language with his household servants, treating this as a campaign rather than a murder. He had thought about it for 2 years. He was calm and precise about every detail. When the signal came, the servants obeyed. Amnon, the firstborn of David, the heir to Israel's throne, was killed at a feast by his own half-brother's men. The other princes fled. Panic spread through the party as they grabbed their mules and scattered in every direction, racing back toward Jerusalem. None of them certain whether this was the beginning of something larger. A messenger reached David with the report that all his sons had been killed. It was wrong, but David did not know that yet. He fell to the ground and tore his royal robes. His servants did the same. Then Jonadab, the same friend who had helped Amnon devise his scheme 2 years earlier, spoke up with information he had clearly been holding. "Only Amnon is dead." This has been Absalom's intention since the day Amnon violated his sister Tamar. Jonadab had known all along. He had watched what Amnon did and tracked what Absalom felt, and said nothing to anyone for 2 years. David mourned. The verse is deliberately unclear about which son he was mourning. Both were lost that day. Amnon to death, and Absalom to exile, because Absalom had already fled. Absalom ran to Geshur, his grandfather's kingdom. His mother's father, King Talmai, was there. Absalom had royal blood on his mother's side. He was not running to a refuge. He was running to family. He was safe in Geshur in a way he could not have been anywhere else after killing the crown prince of Israel. He stayed 3 years. What those 3 years meant for Absalom is not recorded in detail, but we can trace it in what came after. He had time, more time than he probably wanted, to think. He thought about his father's pattern. David had failed to punish Amnon for 2 years. Now David was failing to call Absalom home for 3 more years. This was not an isolated incident of indecision. This was who David was. A man whose love for his sons consistently outpaced his ability to govern them. A man who could not bring himself to act when action was painful. Absalom also thought about what his sister's situation had revealed about how the kingdom worked. Justice in Israel moved through David's preferences, not through principle. Whoever David loved most at any given moment received the benefit of the doubt. Whoever fell out of favor suffered without recourse. He thought about the throne he had grown up believing he was destined for. He was the 3rd son. Amnon had been first, now dead. Chileab, the 2nd son, is barely mentioned in Scripture and appears to have died or been incapacitated early. That made Absalom, by birth order, the heir apparent. But there was no indication David saw it that way. David made no moves toward formal succession. He simply continued to exist as king, aging, paralyzed by his own emotional patterns, loved by the people for his legend, and gradually undermining that legend with every decision he failed to make. Absalom in Geshur was not simply waiting to go home. He was deciding who he was going to be when he returned. Joab, David's nephew and the commander of his armies, understood something the king himself could not articulate. The situation with Absalom could not continue indefinitely. David longed for his exiled son. The text says this plainly. The spirit of the king went out to Absalom. But David would not act on that longing. He was caught between his grief for Amnon and his love for Absalom, between his kingly duty to enforce consequences for murder and his fatherly desire to have his son home. Joab decided to move the king. He found a wise woman from Tekoa and coached her to present herself to David as a mourning widow. She told David a parable. She had 2 sons who fought. One killed the other, and now the whole clan wanted to execute the surviving son. She would be left with no heir, no one to carry on the family name. David responded with the instinct of a man who understood mercy. As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. The woman then turned the parable into a mirror. Why then, she asked, have you allowed this same logic to fail your own son? You would protect a stranger's child who committed murder, but your own son remains in exile? David recognized the construction. He asked who sent her. She admitted, Joab, your servant. He put all these words in my mouth. David called for Joab and gave the order, bring back Absalom. After 3 years, the exile was ending. But the manner of the ending carried its own complication. David allowed Absalom to return to Jerusalem while simultaneously forbidding him from coming into the king's presence. He is not to come before me. Home, but not home. Returned, but not restored. Absalom could walk the streets of Jerusalem, be seen by the people, but he was forbidden from entering the palace, from speaking to his father, from being actually forgiven. This partial restoration was, in a way, a more precise instrument of damage than exile had been. Absalom lived this way for 2 more years. Add them to the previous years, and you have a full accounting of what Absalom carried before the rebellion began. 2 years watching Amnon walk free. 3 years in exile. 2 more years in Jerusalem with his father's door closed to his face. 7 years of various forms of rejection from the man who was supposed to be the greatest king Israel had ever known. The first 2 years had built his patience. The 3 years in Geshur had built his calculation. These final 2 years in Jerusalem, where he was visible and present but excluded, built something else, his contempt for his father as a king. Every day in Jerusalem gave him new evidence. He saw how David administered justice, or failed to. He saw which advisors actually had the king's ear. He saw the tribal tensions within the nation, the grievances from outlying regions that felt Jerusalem's court didn't hear them, the gap between the people's expectations of a king and what David actually delivered. He was learning the kingdom while being kept at its outer edge. And with everything he learned, the thought that had been forming since Geshur became clearer. He would make a better king than his father. Not just a personal belief, a political assessment. David was great once. The stories, were real. But the David who was currently occupying the throne was a man whose emotional instincts overrode his judgment at every critical moment. Israel deserved better governance. Absalom was capable of providing it. Whether he was right or wrong about this is almost beside the point. He believed it, and he began to act on it. First, he needed his father's face. After 2 years of his partial exile in Jerusalem, Absalom summoned Joab. Joab ignored him. He summoned him again. Joab ignored him again. Whether Joab was genuinely busy or simply cautious about reinserting himself into the Absalom situation is not recorded. What is recorded is what Absalom did next. He told his servants to burn Joab's barley field. The field was adjacent to Absalom's own property. Barley was a staple crop, valuable and carefully tended. Setting it on fire was not a minor property dispute. It was a serious act, deliberate and impossible to misinterpret. Joab appeared immediately. When Joab demanded to know why his field had been destroyed, Absalom gave him an answer that cut directly to the point. What is the purpose of my being in Jerusalem if I cannot see my father's face? If there is guilt in me, let him put me to death, but do not leave me in this suspended state. It is worse than exile. At least in Geshur, I had dignity. Joab took the message to David. David called for Absalom. Absalom came before the king and bowed with his face to the ground. This was the formal posture of complete submission before royalty. It said, I acknowledge your authority. I am your subject. I am not here to demand anything. David kissed him. In the cultural context of that moment, a father's kiss after years of separation was not a small gesture. It was acceptance, forgiveness, the declaration that the past was behind them. The kiss should have healed everything, and it would have if the gap between them had been simple time and distance, but it was not. After the reconciliation, Absalom moved. He acquired a chariot and horses and 50 men whose only role was to run before him whenever he traveled through Jerusalem. In ancient Israel, this was not standard behavior for a prince. David himself, the king, did not conduct himself this way. The display was specific and intentional. A chariot announced wealth and military power. Horses multiplied that impression. 50 uniformed men running ahead of you as you passed through the streets of the capital was theater pure, calculated, effective. Every person in Jerusalem who watched Absalom's procession received the same image. This man looked like a king. No other son of David did this. None of his brothers staged daily spectacles of royal power in the city. Only Absalom. And the contrast was the point. He was not merely present in Jerusalem. He was performing kingship in daily public view, training the city's eye to associate his face, his hair, his bearing with the throne. But the chariot was only the visible layer. The more significant campaign was happening on the ground, at street level, before sunrise every morning. Absalom rose early and went to the city gate. In ancient Israel, the gate was where everything happened that mattered. Legal disputes were heard there. Commerce was conducted there. News was exchanged there. And it was specifically where people came when they needed to bring a case before the king for judgment. Absalom positioned himself at the gate before anyone else arrived. When someone came with a legal complaint, he would call out to them, "Where are you from? Which tribe? What brings you here?" He drew people into conversation with the ease of someone who genuinely enjoyed it. And then he listened. He would hear someone's case, their dispute over land or inheritance or a debt, and he would say, "You are absolutely right. Your claim is strong. Your cause is just." Then he would add something else. "But there is no one designated by the king to hear you." This was brilliant manipulation. He was not openly attacking David. He was simply noting, with apparent sympathy, that the judicial system was inadequate. He was planting doubt about the administration's effectiveness without ever making it about the king personally. And then the final move. "If only I had authority, I would give everyone who came to me with a case exactly the justice they deserved." He was running a campaign, a 4-year, systematic, nationwide campaign for the crown, conducted entirely in the open, in the king's own capital, under the king's own nose. And David saw none of it. When people approached Absalom to show proper respect, bowing as you did before royalty, he would not allow it. He would reach out and pull them close and embrace them. Common people, people from every tribe and every background, received the physical warmth from this prince that they expected only from equals or close friends. The effect was exactly what he designed it to be. They felt seen. They felt that this man understood them and cared about their problems in a way that David, aging in his palace, no longer did. They began to think of Absalom not as a prince waiting for his turn, but as a leader who was already, in the ways that mattered, acting like a king. The text summarizes this period with a single precise phrase. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Stole. Not earned. Not won. Stole. The people did not give their loyalty with full information. They were moved by a performance they believed was genuine. They were making comparisons between an old king they could no longer see and a young prince who showed up at their disputes every morning and embraced them like family. The hearts of Israel were taken through a deception so well executed that the people being deceived never suspected anything. 4 years. That is how long Absalom worked at the gate before he decided the moment had come. 4 more years of patience on top of all the previous years of patience. By the time he moved, he had been building this campaign for nearly a decade, if you count from the first day. He began planning in the silence of his grieving for Tamar. He needed to get out of Jerusalem to declare himself king. He could not do it in the capital while David was present. He needed space, time, and a city with symbolic weight. He went to David with a religious request. He had made a vow during his exile in Geshur, he said. He had promised God that if he ever returned to Jerusalem, he would go to Hebron and worship. He needed to fulfill that vow now. Hebron was the perfect choice, for reasons that had nothing to do with any vow. It was David's original capital, the city where he had first been crowned king over Judah before he ruled all Israel. It had historical legitimacy. It was far enough from Jerusalem that news would travel slowly, and David would have little time to respond. And it was in the tribal territory where Absalom had been quietly building support. David suspected nothing. He told him, "Go in peace." Absalom went. He brought 200 men from Jerusalem who had no idea what they were attending. They thought they were going to a religious ceremony. They were cover for a coup. Secret messengers had already been sent throughout every tribe of Israel. The instruction was the same in every region. When you hear the sound of the trumpet, declare that Absalom is king in Hebron. This was a coordinated nationwide signal. When the trumpet sounded, his network of prepared supporters would begin declaring him king simultaneously across all 12 tribes. The rebellion would not emerge from one location. It would erupt everywhere at once, creating momentum that would make resistance seem futile before it could organize. And Absalom had secured one more critical piece. Ahithophel, David's most trusted personal counselor, the man who had advised the king through everything, had agreed to join the rebellion. When that news reached Jerusalem, the word that came with it was the simplest possible description of what had happened. The conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. A messenger reached David with 6 words that collapsed his world. "The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." David's response surprised everyone who heard it, including, probably, the messenger. David did not order a defense. He did not call for his military commanders. He did not begin assessing his options. He said, "Arise and let us flee, or there will be no escape from Absalom. Go quickly, before he overtakes us and brings disaster on the city." David ran. The warrior who had never fled from Goliath, who had fought his way through every enemy that had ever come against Israel, who had spent his entire adult life in combat and governance, chose immediate evacuation over defense of his own capital. He understood something that his commanders may not have fully grasped in that first moment his son had successfully turned the nation against him. The words the messenger used were specific. Not "Absalom's army is advancing," but "the hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom." This was not a military threat that could be defeated with military force. His own people had chosen his son. Fighting them would mean a civil war against his own kingdom. So David walked out. His entire household followed him. His wives, his children, his servants. He left 10 concubines behind to maintain the palace. His personal guard, his foreign mercenaries, his veteran soldiers, these men stayed with him, passing before him in formation as he stood at the city's edge, watching who would come. He crossed the Kidron Valley. He went up the Mount of Olives, weeping, his head covered, his feet bare, a king in mourning for his own capital. The people with him wept as they walked. When word came that Ahithophel, his most trusted counselor, had joined Absalom's conspiracy, David prayed one specific prayer: turn Ahithophel's counsel to foolishness. He did not pray for military victory. He prayed for the wisdom of the man advising his enemy to fail. That prayer would matter more than any army. When Absalom entered Jerusalem and found it empty of David, he asked his newly acquired counselor Ahithophel for strategic guidance. Ahithophel's advice was precise and calculated on multiple levels. He recommended that Absalom publicly claim David's concubines, the 10 women left behind to maintain the palace. In ancient culture, taking a king's household was not merely a statement of conquest. It was a declaration of absolute ownership and irreversible succession. By doing this, Absalom would be communicating several things simultaneously to everyone who saw it. He had completely replaced his father. There was no possibility of reconciliation or restoration. And every person who had joined his rebellion could be absolutely certain there was no turning back. Ahithophel understood the psychology of coalitions. People who supported Absalom were taking an enormous risk. If David returned, they would face judgment for treason. The fear of that outcome could erode their commitment. But if Absalom committed an act that made reconciliation with David literally impossible, the risk calculation for his supporters changed completely. They had no choice but to see this through. They erected a tent on the palace rooftop, the same roof where David had once walked in the evening, and made the decision that Nathan would later call his greatest sin. The same roof, the same palace. And on that roof, in the sight of all Israel, exactly as the prophet Nathan had declared years before, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. Prophecy was being fulfilled on the same spot where it had been earned. Ahithophel had one more piece of advice, and it was the most dangerous counsel Absalom received. Do not wait to build up the largest possible army. Let me take 12,000 men tonight, right now, and pursue David before he can cross the Jordan River. His people are exhausted and demoralized. A night attack will create panic. I will strike only the king. When David is dead, everyone with him will scatter and come home. The rebellion ends tonight, and no one else has to die. This plan was, from a purely strategic standpoint, excellent. David and his followers had just walked out of Jerusalem on foot. They were emotionally broken, physically tired, and psychologically unprepared for an immediate military assault. Ahithophel's plan would end the conflict at minimal cost before David could organize, cross the river, and reach allies who would give him strength. Everyone agreed it was a good plan. But David, fleeing barefoot up the Mount of Olives, had done one thing before he left the city. He had sent a man named Hushai back into Jerusalem with one instruction: when Ahithophel gives counsel, counter it. Hushai had been David's companion and advisor. He presented himself to Absalom as someone who had transferred his loyalty with the transition of power. And Absalom, who had spent years studying how to read people, failed to read this one. When Ahithophel's plan had just been unanimously approved, Absalom decided to hear one more opinion. Hushai delivered a masterpiece of counter-persuasion. He said, "You know your father and his men. They are experienced warriors. They are angry like a mother bear whose cubs have been taken. Do not underestimate them. David will not spend the night in an accessible camp. He will be in a pit or a cave or some unexpected location. If your strike force arrives and meets even initial resistance, word will spread that there has been a slaughter among Absalom's men, and even the most courageous soldiers will lose their nerve when they hear that David is fighting back. Then the alternative, instead of 12,000 tonight, gather all Israel from every tribe, an army so vast that when it moves, it will cover the ground like dew. You yourself will lead it, and when we find David, we will overwhelm him completely. Absalom liked the second plan better. The scripture tells us why the Lord had ordained to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, in order to bring harm upon Absalom. The prayer David prayed on the Mount of Olives had been heard. The best military mind in the rebellion had given the correct advice. It had been rejected. David was given the time he needed. David crossed the Jordan River. He gathered his forces, organized his commanders, and prepared to fight. The battle he had tried to avoid was coming. And when it came, he gave his 3 military leaders one specific command that all the people heard. Deal gently with the young man Absalom. He said this to Joab, to Abishai, and to Ittai. He said it in front of everyone. His son had driven him from his throne, had publicly humiliated him, had raised an army against him, and David's standing instruction was, spare him. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. It was not the kind of terrain where Absalom's large army could use its numerical advantage. The forest was dense, difficult, full of the kind of irregular terrain that breaks up formations and separates units from their commanders. David's veteran fighters, who had spent decades fighting in every condition imaginable, were far better suited to it than Absalom's force, which was large but largely untested. 20,000 of Absalom's soldiers fell that day, and the text records something striking. The forest itself killed more men than the fighting did. The terrain was the weapon. Men were lost in ravines, separated, unable to find their units, trapped in ground they did not know. Absalom's army collapsed, and Absalom tried to escape. He was riding his mule through the forest when the branch of a great oak caught him. His head went into it. The mule kept moving, and there he hung between the ground and the sky, unable to touch either. A soldier saw him and ran to tell Joab. Joab's response was immediate frustration. You saw him hanging there and you didn't kill him? I would have given you silver and a belt. The soldier gave him the only possible answer. The king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai to protect the young man, Absalom. Even for 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not have raised my hand against the king's son. You heard the command. Joab had no patience for this reasoning. He took 3 javelins in his hand and drove them into Absalom's chest while he was still alive in the tree. Then 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded the body and finished it. The man who had been suspended between heaven and earth was gone. David waited at Mahanaim. He sat at the gate of the city, not fighting, not commanding, just waiting, watching the road. Waiting for runners who would bring news of the battle, news of his army, news of his son. A watchman saw a figure running alone across the plain, then 2. A single runner usually meant news. The first runner arrived. He announced victory. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against you. David's only question, is it well with the young man Absalom? The runner was not sure. He had seen commotion, but did not know exactly what had happened. The second runner arrived. He confirmed the victory more specifically. David's only question again, is it well with the young man Absalom? The second runner answered with the careful language of someone delivering devastating news to a king. May the enemies of my lord, the king, be as that young man is. David understood. He went up to the chamber above the gate and wept. And as he went, he said the words that have carried their weight for 3,000 years. O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. He did not say he deserved it. He did not say justice was served. He did not say the rebellion is over, the kingdom is safe, now we can move forward. He said only his son's name, over and over, the name of the child he had loved and failed and lost and would have traded his own life to save. Victory meant nothing. The kingdom meant nothing. His army returned from battle and came into the city quietly, as if they were ashamed. No celebration. The king was weeping for his son. There is one more detail. During his lifetime, while he was still riding through Jerusalem with his chariot and his 50 runners, Absalom had erected a stone pillar in the king's valley. He explained why I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. Scripture tells us earlier that Absalom had 3 sons. By the time he built the monument, all 3 were dead. He had fought for a throne he could not pass to anyone. He had built a dynasty he could not continue. He had stolen a kingdom for an heir who did not exist. He named the pillar after himself. People called it by that name afterward. But instead of a monument to greatness, it became a monument to everything that ambition without wisdom costs. The most beautiful man in all of Israel. The most charismatic political operator of his generation. The son of the greatest king Israel had known. He ended in a pit in a forest, covered with stones. Not a royal burial, a criminal's burial. And his father wept his name into an empty room, while the victorious army came home in silence. Here is the question to sit with after all of this. Did Absalom have legitimate grievances? His sister was violated, and his father did nothing. He asked for justice, and was ignored for years. He spent the better part of a decade in various forms of exile and exclusion. The wounds were real. The wounds were real. And the response destroyed everything. Not because Absalom was wrong about David's failures. He was largely right about them. But because the person who is right about someone else's failures still has to decide what to do with that information. And Absalom decided to consume himself with acquiring what he believed he deserved, instead of becoming who he was actually capable of being. The stone pillar he built to preserve his name still carried it, but not the way he intended. God bless you. See you in the next one. What do you think was Absalom's rebellion caused by David's failure, or by Absalom's ambition? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.